In the early hours of what seemed like an ordinary day, Beijing lay beneath a sky heavy with unspoken secrets. The air was thick, humid, almost suffocating. A subtle stillness gripped the sprawling metropolis as if nature itself were holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. The streets hummed with the usual bustle of morning commuters, vendors setting up stalls, and children reluctantly heading to school. Life continued as usual, yet an undercurrent of unease lingered, felt only by a few who glanced nervously at the darkening clouds gathering on the horizon. Meteorologists had been tracking an enormous storm brewing over the Pacific, a monster of rain and wind named Typhoon Whipfer. Early warnings flashed across weather channels and emergency broadcasts. A threat like no other was fast approaching, and the government urged citizens to prepare. But many brushed off these cautions as routine alarmism, another tempest that would pass without wreaking havoc. Yet nature does not negotiate with skepticism. As the sun climbed higher, the skies darkened ominously. Soon the heavens opened, unleashing a relentless downpour that drummed violently against rooftops and windows. At first it seemed a heavy rainstorm, familiar to the city's residents accustomed to seasonal showers. But the rain showed no sign of abating. Instead, it intensified, torrents cascading from the sky with an unyielding fury. Within hours, the city's intricate network of drainage and waterways began to falter. Streets turned slick with sheets of water, gutters overflowed, and puddles expanded into small lakes. Traffic stalled as engines drowned in rising water, and frantic drivers abandoned vehicles, seeking refuge on higher ground. Reports from the outskirts told of swollen rivers bursting their banks, streams turning into violent torrents, carving new paths through the countryside. Reservoirs, already near capacity from weeks of unseasonal rain, strained under the deluge. Emergency alerts escalated to urgent warnings, but the city's heartbeat still pulsed, unaware of the calamity growing just beyond its edges. As night fell, Beijing's famed skyline, the silhouettes of towering skyscrapers and ancient pagodas, began to blur behind the sheets of rain. Power flickered sporadically, then plunged entire neighborhoods into darkness. Cell phone signals wavered, and communication lines faltered, sowing confusion and fear. Beneath the surface, unseen by the millions sheltering indoors, nature's wrath was gathering strength. The dams that safeguarded the city, engineered to withstand centuries of storms, now groaned under a weight they were never meant to bear. Cracks whispered warnings that few could hear over the roar of the tempest. Then, the unimaginable happened. A deafening explosion shattered the night's grim symphony. One of the largest dams, an enormous concrete leviathan standing watch over the valley, gave way. A monstrous wave of water surged forth, a wall of destruction racing toward the city like a beast unleashed from its cage. In that terrifying instant, the streets became rivers, and rivers transformed into torrents of death. Buildings shuddered as water clawed at their foundations. Bridges trembled, creaking under the assault, some giving way in catastrophic collapse. The city, vibrant and alive just hours before, was now a battlefield, between man and nature, between survival and annihilation. Amid the chaos, cries for help echoed through flooded neighborhoods. Families scrambled onto rooftops and balconies, clinging desperately to hope as the waters rose. Emergency sirens wailed, drowned at times by the roar of the flood and the cracking of timber and concrete. This was not merely a storm, it was a reckoning. The great flood had arrived, swallowing streets, homes, and dreams alike. The very heart of a nation was submerged, the pulse of a city threatened with extinction. As dawn approached, a strange silence fell, a pause in the tempest, a moment for the world to catch its breath and witness the devastating aftermath. What remained of Beijing was a landscape transformed, waterlogged ruins, shattered lives, and the sobering reminder of nature's unforgiving power. This was only the beginning. As the first light of dawn pierced the storm-heavy sky, Beijing was already unrecognizable. The once bustling city streets had surrendered beneath an unrelenting sea of water. Cars floated like fragile toys. Shop fronts and homes stood half-submerged, their walls groaning under the weight of the flood. The relentless rain showed no mercy. Hours stretched into days as the downpour continued, each minute adding inches to the swelling floodwaters. The city's famed waterways, rivers and canals engineered over centuries, became violent currents, tearing through neighborhoods with devastating force. Evacuation orders had been broadcast repeatedly, but the chaos overwhelmed infrastructure and nerves alike. Roads and highways, normally arteries of movement, had turned into perilous waterways or were blocked by debris and collapsed bridges. Thousands found themselves stranded, trapped on rooftops, in high-rise apartments, or in vehicles swallowed by water. In districts where the water depth reached the second floors of buildings, the battle for survival shifted indoors. Families huddled in darkened rooms, rationing food and water, their only companions the distant thunder and the omnipresent, terrifying sound of rushing water. Meanwhile, rescue teams mobilized amidst impossible conditions. Helicopters braved lashing rain and powerful winds to locate stranded survivors, lowering ropes and baskets to pluck the desperate from their watery prisons. Boats navigated narrow, submerged streets, their crews calling out through megaphones to guide the frightened toward temporary safety zones. But with every rescue came a painful realization: the scale of destruction far exceeded initial estimates. Hospitals, already stretched thin, struggled to care for the injured and those succumbing to hypothermia and exhaustion. Power outages plunged critical care units into darkness, forcing the use of backup generators that strained under constant use. Compounding the crisis, landslides triggered by saturated soil cascaded down nearby hillsides, obliterating small villages and cutting off key supply routes. The earth itself seemed to rebel, swallowing roads and homes in a deadly embrace. The floodwaters were relentless, but so too were the stories of courage and despair. A young mother clutching her newborn fought to stay above water amid the ruins of her neighborhood. An elderly couple, stranded without food or medicine, were found days later, holding hands as rescuers arrived. Volunteers waded through chest-deep water, delivering aid and comfort to those left behind. Across the city, the flood was more than a natural disaster. It was a test of human endurance and spirit. International aid began to trickle in, but the scale of devastation demanded more than immediate relief. Questions arose about the underlying causes. Climate change, urban planning failures, and aging infrastructure all played their part in turning a severe storm into an apocalyptic event. As floodwaters crept higher, government officials urged calm and unity, emphasizing ongoing efforts to bolster defenses and support displaced citizens. Yet, beneath the official statements lay the stark reality. Beijing's fight against the flood was far from over. And as the waters continued to rise, so too did the fear that this catastrophe might signal a new era, one where cities once thought invincible could vanish overnight beneath the wrath of nature. The nightmare deepened as the Great Flood relentlessly advanced, testing not only the resilience of Beijing's people, but also the very structures designed to protect them. For days, the city had fought a losing battle against rising waters. But now, the very foundations beneath their feet began to crumble. Engineers and emergency crews monitored the city's sprawling network of dams and levees with growing dread. Built decades ago, these colossal barriers had stood as bulwarks against nature's fury. But even the mightiest defenses have limits. The unprecedented rain had pushed reservoirs to bursting point, the pressure mounting to terrifying levels. Suddenly, a deafening roar shattered the uneasy silence. A dam on the outskirts of the metropolitan area, a critical piece of infrastructure holding back millions of cubic meters of water, gave way. The collapse unleashed a devastating wall of water that surged toward the city at unimaginable speed. Neighborhoods downstream were the first to bear the brunt. Entire blocks vanished beneath the floodwaters in seconds. Streets transformed into rapids, sweeping away vehicles, homes, and everything in their path. The sheer force of the deluge tore through concrete barriers, uprooted trees, and shattered windows with brutal efficiency. As the water surged through the urban heart, bridges that had stood for centuries began to buckle. The iconic spans that connected communities collapsed under the onslaught, sending twisted metal and concrete crashing into the turbulent currents. Commuters and rescue workers alike found their paths cut off, stranding thousands in isolated pockets of the city. Power plants and communication hubs were inundated, plunging vast areas into darkness and severing vital lines of contact. Hospitals grappled with failing generators and dwindling supplies as paramedics worked frantically to evacuate critical patients. In the midst of this chaos, emergency sirens blared warnings, but many were drowned out by the roar of destruction. Panic swept through the city like wildfire. Families torn apart sought refuge wherever they could find it, on rooftops, in school gyms converted into shelters, and in hastily erected emergency tents. Tragically, not all could be saved. Rescue teams found themselves racing against time and nature, pulling survivors from debris, cold water, and crushing ruins. The death toll began to rise, and with each life lost, the collective heart of the city broke a little more. The floodwaters showed no sign of relenting, threatening to engulf even more of Beijing and its surrounding regions. Roads and railways essential for bringing in aid and evacuating civilians were severed, isolating entire communities. Amid the devastation, harrowing stories emerged. An entire family trapped inside a collapsing apartment building sent a desperate video message, their voices trembling with fear and hope. Volunteers waded through chest-deep water to deliver medicine and food to those too weak or injured to move. A lone firefighter battled floodwaters to reach an elderly woman clinging to life in her submerged home. The city that once stood proud and unshakable was now a patchwork of drowned neighborhoods, shattered infrastructure, and heartbreak. The Great Flood was no longer a distant threat. It was an overwhelming, inescapable reality. As the waters continued their merciless march, Beijing and the world watched in stunned silence, knowing that the aftermath of this disaster would echo for years to come.